exactly is the threat to peace in South China Sea? And here, very stupid. You of course, if I have to be short and brusque and blunt, I have to oversimplify things, and we can do the qualifications later. But there's basically a Western narrative, and what I would say for shorthand form, an Asian narrative. And the Western narrative is very clear, very stark, very direct. Why is there a threat of war in South China Sea? It's because China has emerged as a great power, and with China's emergence as a great power, it is now threatening its Southeast Asian neighbors. It's reinforcing the islands in the South China Sea. It has a 9-dash line claiming all of South China Sea. And of course, you saw that when Philippines took China to the tribunal, China rejected it. And, and then Xi Jinping promised to demilitarize the South China Sea, and then he broke his promise. All this you can find, by the way, in my book, Has China Won? All the details. So the Western narrative is very stark, very clear. And as someone who travels around the world, I can tell you that the Anglo-Saxon media makes it clear there's only one narrative, and that's the correct narrative. But then what I call the Asian narrative, again, at the risk of oversimplification, that the problem in South China Sea is really not between China and the Southeast Asian countries, is that this region is basically becoming a pawn in a much bigger geopolitical struggle that has emerged between the United States and China. And the real threat to this region doesn't come from China's aggression or China's assertiveness. It comes from the fact that now, when the United States is looking for ways and means of embarrassing or bringing down China, it's very useful to use South China Sea as a weapon against China, and use everything there and say, see, all this proves that China is aggressive, assertive, duplicitous, and so on and so forth. So I hope that's made it clear. These are the two narratives. But the next question is, which narrative is right? And I can tell you that in the Western world, there's a total conviction that the Western narrative is right, and there's no other narrative to consider. And what is interesting, I find, is that you cannot even get agreement on what are the facts between the two cases. So I'll give you a simple example. I've spoken to so many people in Europe and the United States. They are absolutely convinced that Xi Jinping was completely duplicitous in promising to demilitarize the South China Sea, and then reneged on his promise and went ahead and militarized the South China Sea. I haven't met a single person in the West who doubts this to be the truth. But I discovered, ironically, from a former American ambassador to China, who will go down as one of the best ambassadors of the United States ever to China. And some people in Singapore also know him very well, because he also was a U.S. ambassador to Singapore. His name is Stapleton Roy. He actually, as a child, grew up in China, speaks Chinese fluently, understands China very deeply. And when I was doing research for my book, Has China Won?, I had a one-on-one lunch with him in Washington, D.C. And he told me, Kishore, at the meeting between Xi Jinping and Obama raised the subject of South China Sea and said, why are you being so assertive? And Xi Jinping told Obama, okay, if you think this is the problem, why don't both of us agree? We both of us agree to demilitarize the South China Sea, and neither China nor US will set up military facilities in South China Sea. And Stapleton Roy said to me, Kishore, we should have seized that offer and said, good, because what we would have accomplished is we would have got China to demilitarize an area right next to China. This is a gift to the United States. And Stapleton Roy said to me, stupidly, we rebuffed that offer and we stepped up the naval patrols. So instead of Xi Jinping being duplicitous and having reneged on his promise, he actually made an offer that was rebuffed. This is factually true, but completely unknown in the West. And what is for me shocking, I put it at the opening section of a whole chapter. I describe all this in great details, but the Anglo-Saxon media will never tell the alternative story. And one of the things that has become clear to me as I study this US-China contest as deeply as I can, is that the Anglo-Saxon media will tell outright lies, which for many in Singapore is very hard to believe because we have become prisoners of the Anglo-Saxon media, and so we cannot accept the fact that sometimes they're telling outright lies on some issues. And so especially when it comes to South China Sea, we must learn to be very wary of all the facts. So for example, I'll give you another example. They will talk about how much China has claimed land in its features in the South China Sea. But the question is, who started this process? Was it China or was it the other Southeast Asian claimants? And unfortunately, the Southeast Asian claimants started it. So China said, okay, if you do it, I'll do it. Only difference is that, if Malaysia can claim 20 acres, Chinese will claim 2,000 acres. So that's a game, right? So therefore, getting the facts on this case is very, very difficult. So at the end of the day, I think that we have to be very wary of the Western narrative and be clear that clearly what's happening in South China Sea is that we are now becoming sucked into a major geopolitical contest, which, by the way, will accelerate over the next 10 years, and there's absolutely no